This video is about artificial selection and genetic modification, which are two methods of changing a population where humans decide what traits the population is going to have. So it's kind of like natural selection, except for that natural selection changes the population naturally based on the environment. But artificial selection and genetic modification, it's humans choosing what traits the animals are going to have. So here's an example. I've got a picture of some dairy cows down here. So let's imagine there's a dairy farmer. When they have their cows reproduce, they're going to want to have the cows that produce the most milk. They want those ones to have offspring because their offspring are more likely to produce more milk, right? If they have a cow that doesn't produce very much milk, they're probably going to want to prevent that one from reproducing, because if it does have offspring, its offspring probably won't produce as much milk, just like the parent didn't produce as much milk, right? So artificial selection is when humans choose. Oh, whoops. Hold on. I got to turn on my phone, my pen. I got to turn on my pen. Here we go. It's when humans choose which animals or plants get to reproduce and pass on their traits. And because they're choosing which organism gets to reproduce, they're also choosing which traits they want the population to have. So let's look at another example of this. This one's really cool. You know about what modern corn looks like, but hundreds of years ago it actually looked like this. It was called teosinte, and it changed over hundreds of years based on which ones people replanted. So for example, let's say you're growing teosinte and you have a stalk with a few kernels, and then you have another stalk that happened to grow a lot more kernels because of its genetics, right? The one that you're probably going to replant from is this one because it produces more kernels, and the kernels are the part that you eat, right? So you would take a kernel from that one and replant it, and then when it grows into a plant, that plant is going to produce more kernels, right? So that happened over hundreds of years until we got modern corn today with lots and lots of kernels. And that's because over time people were only replanting seeds from the plants that had more kernels. If they had a plant like this one on the left here that didn't produce very many kernels, they would not replant from a seed on that plant, right? Because they don't want more plants that don't produce very many kernels, okay? So that is another example of artificial selection. This is a slightly different type of artificial selection where you can actually crossbreed or cross-pollinate two different species as long as they are closely related. So in this case we have tangerines and grapefruit. They are different, but they're pretty closely related. So what scientists have done is they take a paintbrush or something, they take pollen from the flower of a tangerine tree, and then they put it into the flower of a grapefruit tree. And then what you get is a tangelo, which looks like this, and it's a hybrid. It's a mixture of DNA from tangerines and from grapefruits. So that's artificial selection as well, because maybe you like the flavor of the tangerine and you want to combine it with the size of the grapefruit or something. So when there are two different species that have traits that you want combined into one, you can combine them, but only if they're closely related enough. So that is also artificial selection. Okay, so genetic modification. This looks complicated, but it's actually not. Let me explain what's going on here. So we have a human cell, and we took DNA from the human cell that has a gene for growth hormone, right? And then they put it into bacterial DNA. So here's the bacterial DNA. They put the gene for human growth hormone into that. And so now here we have the bacterial DNA right here. And it has the gene for human growth hormone in it. And they put it back into the bacteria. And then the bacteria's machinery that usually builds proteins is suddenly reading this gene for human growth hormone. And the bacteria actually produce that protein because they have the DNA from the human cell for human growth hormone. They actually do this with insulin as well. So for people with diabetes who can't produce insulin, they will take the gene for insulin from a human cell, put it into bacterial DNA, and then the bacteria will produce insulin so that we have more human insulin for people who need it. So that is genetic modification. You cut the gene out of one thing and put it into the DNA of another thing that you want to have that trait. So let's look at another example of that. They had tomatoes that could withstand the frost, and they did that with genetic modification. The way they did that is this on the right is an Antarctic toothfish, and it lives in freezing cold waters. So it has a protein in its blood that prevents its blood from freezing. So what they did is they took out just the gene for that one protein out of the Antarctic toothfish. So they didn't take the gene for fins or a tail or anything like that, just the gene that helps its blood not freeze. And then they put that into the tomato DNA. But here's the catch. They had to do it before the tomato plant even grew, because otherwise they would have to stick it in all the cells individually, which is like billions of cells, and that wouldn't work. So what they did is they put the gene into the cell inside the seed, like the little embryo inside the seed, because there's fewer cells in there. And then when the plant did grow, the whole plant, all of its cells had the gene to help it withstand the cold, the gene that they got from the Antarctic toothfish. So then these tomatoes were better able to withstand the frost because of this gene. So that's an example of genetic modification, but it has to be done before the plant grows. They can also do genetic modification in animals as well, but they have to do it before the animal is born, when it's just a little embryo, just a few cells. Then they modify those cells before they multiply into billions and trillions of cells. You can't do it once the animal is already born or the plant has already grown. Okay. Oh yeah, and that's what I was going to talk about here. What's wrong with this picture on the right is that they are supposedly injecting DNA into an already grown tomato, which, as I just explained, doesn't work because this tomato is made of lots and lots of cells. They would have had to do it before they even planted the tomato plant. And then this picture on the left is also wrong because, as I told you, they were only taking the gene from the Antarctic toothfish that helped its blood not freeze. They didn't take the gene for a tail or scales or anything like that, right? Okay. And here's a comparison between the two. So in artificial selection, you cannot change a fully grown organism, right? That's where you choose which animals or plants reproduce, right? So you have to choose before they do reproduce. So you can't change it if it's fully grown. It does add new DNA. If you are cross-pollinating or cross-breeding two different species, that's when it adds new DNA. You can only add genes from an organism that is closely related. Like I talked about the tangerine and the grapefruit. They're closely related. You couldn't do that with a banana and a grapefruit because they're not closely related. And you can add multiple genes at once because you're adding a lot of genes from the grapefruit to the tangerine all at once. Now, with genetic modification, you also cannot change a fully grown organism. Like I said, you have to do it before you plant the plant or before the animal is born, right? It also adds new DNA, but here's the difference. It can add genes from any organism. Antarctic toothfish and tomatoes are not closely related at all. In fact, one is an animal and one is a plant. But we could still take the gene out of the fish and add it to the tomato. So you can add genes from any organism, but you can only add one gene at a time. Like I said, they didn't add genes for like a tail and scales and stuff. They just added one gene at a time. So I hope that was helpful, and good luck on the test.